Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Scott Leadingham, and I am with Austin Jenkins, the Olympia correspondent for the Northwest News Network. Austin just wrapped up a 60-day session in Olympia covering the legislature, and he joins us today here on Facebook. Thank you so much for joining us, Austin.
It's great to be here, Scott. Thanks for having me.
I should say, if anyone has any questions, if you're joining us for the live stream, you can ask those in the comment section, and we'll try to get to them. Austin, the first question, let's get to it, from me is, how does it feel being done with the session? And if you can describe the session in just a word or a phrase, what would it be?
I would say shot out of a cannon. This was a 60-day short election year legislative session that was chock-a-block full of action and bills being passed. And I think it was a reflection on the fact that Democrats once again have one-party control of Olympia. The margins are narrow, but they do have one-party control. First time they've had that in 5 years, I believe. And it really did change the dynamic. They seized that majority and ran with it, especially the state Senate, which until this year has been controlled by Republicans or a coalition of Republicans and Democrats over the last several years. So a very different dynamic in a very busy 60 days.
As the session was wrapping up yesterday, you did a roundup of the bills that passed and didn't pass, and people can read that at nwpb.org, little shameless plug there. But in your own words, what are some of the big bills that happened, those that failed to pass, and what were those implications for people all around the state of Washington?
The list is so long, I've got to use that as my cheat sheet because it really is remarkable how many bills passed, and really it probably makes sense to break this apart a little bit. So let's go back to January and the fact that last year the legislature failed to pass a capital construction budget. That's the budget that builds stuff in schools, classrooms, buildings, and projects in communities across the state, legislative districts across the state. That didn't pass last year because of a fight over how to respond to a Supreme Court decision that effectively shut off the drilling of exempt or non-permitted wells in many parts of rural Washington. Senate Republicans last year said they wouldn't vote for the capital budget until they figured out a so-called Hearst fix, Hearst being the name of that Supreme Court case. So that carried over into this session. In January, they got a deal on Hearst, a bipartisan deal on Hearst. That paved the way to pass the state capital construction budget. So that was a significant win for both parties early on in the session. The other big thing that they had to do coming into this legislature is the Supreme Court, you'll recall, last fall said, you have taken the steps you need to take to fully fund schools, amply fund schools as required by the Constitution. And of course, this is in the ongoing McCleary school funding case. But the Supreme Court said there is a problem, though. You were about a year late and $1 billion short on fully funding teacher and staff salaries. So you got to come up with that money. The legislature, majority of Democrats in their budget, have done that. They have come up with the money. They believe that what they accomplished this session will get them out of contempt of court, end this $100,000 a day fine that's been piling up for a couple of years now, and potentially end the McCleary school funding case, which has been going on for a decade. So those are some of the big issues. But we can keep going down the list. They passed a ban on bump stocks, the device that was used by the Las Vegas last fall in the mass killing in Las Vegas. You know, turns a semi-automatic weapon into more like an automatic fire weapon. They passed a ban on net pens after the salmon in Puget Sound last summer. They passed a first-in-the-nation net neutrality law. And then there were a lot of pent-up things that Democrats had wanted to do for years. You're looking at a couple of them here on the screen right now. Insurance coverage for abortion. They call it the Reproductive Parity Act, but it requires insurance companies that cover maternity services to also cover abortion. There was an update to the state's Equal Pay Act, which hasn't been updated, I think, since 1943, a requirement that high-poverty schools provide breakfast after the start of the school day for kids who get to school by bus and don't have time to eat breakfast before the start of classes. So that's in the what passed list. If you want to talk about a couple of things that didn't pass, a carbon tax. The governor's big priority once again this year was a carbon tax. It did get out of a couple of committees, didn't pass into law. He's not giving up. Neither are supporters. There's already a proposed initiative for this fall. And the other maybe big issue that made a lot of yardage but didn't pass through the legislature was an effort to repeal the death penalty. It actually passed out of the state Senate. Previously, it had never even gotten out of committee. Got out of the state Senate on a bipartisan vote. The prime sponsor was a Republican, Maureen Walsh, who represents Walla Walla, where the state pen and death row is. Supporters of repeal think that this was a significant step towards ultimate and eventual repeal in the coming years of capital punishment in Washington.
So it sounds like it was a very busy 60-day session. We did have a question come in from someone on Facebook asking about bipartisanship. We hear a lot about partisan rancor, frankly, nationwide in the halls of Congress and in other state houses. Were there any major points of bipartisan agreement in this 60-day session that we can point to as the two parties working together?
There is a general rule of thumb that about 80% of what the legislature does is unanimous or nearly unanimous. They agree on the vast majority of things that they're doing. And that's because a lot of that stuff is just not all that controversial. It's the 20% where things get a little tense, a little chippy, they can start to go off the rails. So I gave the example previously of the Hearst water fix that led to the capital budget moving. That was an example of an agreement. Not everybody got everything they wanted, but that was an example of working together on a hard issue. Mental health. And by the way, the supplemental budget, the update to the 60-year budget, includes another $300 million for mental health. Now, the budget itself was a Democrat budget, but mental health is an issue that unifies Democrats and Republicans. So is the opioid crisis, something that both sides of the aisle very much are concerned about, seeing the effects of in their communities, whether those are rural or urban communities. There's keen interest in continuing to address the opioid crisis, get medicine-assisted treatment into more rural areas, and that's bipartisan. We saw some moments where things really did come off the rails. There was a bill backed by the Service Employees International Union that represents home care workers that will privatize the home care workforce. Republicans feel that this is a backdoor way of mandating, making compulsory union membership. And Republicans on the floor of the House actually walked off the floor and refused to vote on that bill when they felt like debate was shut down. Republicans said that this was Democrats doing a favor to a big campaign donor. This was one issue that really blew things up. And then in the final days of the session, there was a lot of partisan rancor, to use your term, over two things. One, the way that the Democrats were proposing to pay for a property tax cut, which is another key issue that came out of this session, but property tax cut that'll kick in next year. The Republicans said that the way that's being funded is by taking or siphoning off money that was headed to the constitutionally protected rainy day fund. Republicans said that that was unconstitutional and hugely problematic. Republicans were also very concerned about a plan to address the issue of police deadly force in Washington's very high threshold in the nation for criminally charging police officers who use deadly force in egregious circumstances. There was a deal at the last minute to keep a ballot measure off the fall ballot and to change the law at the legislative level. Once again, Republicans said it was an end run around the Constitution, legally dubious, and they were very upset about the process. So there were examples like that where there were serious tensions between the two parties. Many other times, they were quite collegiate.
Well, talking about things upon which everyone can agree, I think we can agree amongst ourselves and in state houses that the topic of sexual harassment in the halls of legislative chambers and society writ large needs to be addressed. And we went into this session in the year hearing a lot about sexual harassment and the Me Too campaign in legislative chambers, including Washington state's. How did this session end with regard to those topics versus kind of how it began just a few months ago?
And it began with reporting that I did with Walker Orenstein of the News Tribune and the Olympian, where really for the first time, women late last year felt comfortable coming forward. Comfortable is maybe not the right word, but were willing to come forward and talk about what they had experienced over the years in the halls of the state legislature. And what they described was everything from inappropriate comments, touching and hugging that was lingering in nature, to pats on the rear end and forced kissing and behavior that crossed a line even into what some would consider to be assaultive. So a very serious issue. It got the attention of the leadership. There was a letter from more than 200 women who work in and around the legislature, who have worked here, asking the leadership of the legislature to address this head on. Early in session, there was a joint House-Senate resolution that was going to create a 14-member task force bicameral between the two chambers to start to look at ways to align the policies between the House and Senate, which are different, to look for ways to give lobbyists some protection, and also to hold lobbyists accountable for their behavior, and to give victims a way to report to an independent party, not necessarily to the House clerk or the Senate secretary, but independent. Well, that resolution passed off the House floor and failed to pass off the Senate. There was criticism about the nature, the way that the task force would be comprised, and it never came back to life. We know that behind the scenes, there has been extensive additional sexual harassment training. There are staff surveys that have gone out. Each chamber has appointed people to work on this issue. They still have not figured out how to bring the House and Senate together, nor have they figured out an independent reporting system. What we're being told is that this is going to take time, that this is harder than they thought it was going to be, and that likely over the next 9 months, they'll be working on this issue with the goal of having some proposals come back for January for the next session. I do want to mention, though, that 3 bills did pass out of the legislature dealing with sexual harassment in workplaces, not just the legislature, but across the state of Washington, including one that will have the Human Rights Commission work with stakeholders to produce so-called model policies for sexual harassment in the workplace.
That is long overdue in being addressed. Finally, Austin, as we're wrapping up, I know you're probably going to want to take at least a little bit of vacation after this, understandably. It's a marathon, 60 days. But what else is coming up on your docket for coverage outside of the legislature? What do you got coming up for us?
Well, it's good context just to think about a short election year session, the precursor to what will be a busy election year, where all of the state house members are up for re-election. About half the state senators will be. There are going to be many open seats. We've seen a wave of announced retirements from the legislature. So it's going to be a busy campaign season. Clearly, Democrats are looking to make some gains in light of the national political scene. But keep in mind, we've got very narrow majorities here, and the legislature is always very much in play these days in terms of who's going to be controlling it. So that's one thing. But the other thing that I think about is that the legislative session ends, they appropriate money, and then my job the rest of the year is to cover state government, to see how that money is being spent, to find out where public agencies are doing a good job and where they are falling short, and really follow the money and dig into some of the issues. Mental health is an example. But prior to the Me Too movement, I was very focused on covering mental health. The Me Too movement happened, got very busy covering that, but I really hope to get back to mental health because that is one area, besides education in the state, where we have a system that is really struggling right now. It's fractured. People are not getting the services they need. There have been lawsuits. The state's in contempt of court on that issue and paying fines. And shoring up the mental health system seems like a real challenge for the state in the coming years, and that's certainly one example of a topic I'm going to be focusing on in the weeks and months ahead.
Well, we will certainly follow with interest your time away from the legislature until the next session starts next year. Austin Jenkins covers Olympia for the Northwest News Network. Thank you so much for joining us today, Austin.
Thank you for having me. It was great.